Hello, everyone. So thank you for taking up our very short notice and joining us today, despite the last-minute decision from our end to organize this webinar. My name is Philip Gamaghelyan. I'm an editor at Caucasus Edition, the journal that's organizing the webinar. I'm also a professor at the Kroc School of Peace Studies at the University of San Diego. And I'm joined today by my good friend and colleague, Lala Darchinova. Lala, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, Philip. Hi, everyone. I'm Lala Darchinova, and I am the editor at the Caucasus Edition, and at the same time, I'm the researcher at the European University Institute.
Thank you. A couple of words about the format, since, again, it was last minute, so you know what to expect. We intend to hold you for no longer than 1 hour, so let's say exactly 1 hour, because it will be 10 o'clock in the South Caucasus when we end. We'll try not to go past that. And for the first about 30 minutes, Lala and I will have a conversation, just two of us, and from there on, we will open it to questions and answers. You should have a Q&A button in the bottom. Feel free, please, to post comments there. And we will questions there, and we will be happy to address them, as many as we can. Also, you can go to the chat button and post comments if there are not questions. That's somewhat of the usual format that we held in the past. And want to also set some expectations, right? We do not possess, I assume everybody's following the news, and maybe there is an interest in some additional news. So we don't have any special information any more than any of you. Our information is pretty much from news and conversations with friends and family, again, pretty much, as I'm assuming, with everybody else. So it's not like we want to share anything more than you already don't know. The focus is why we wanted to talk, what we wanted to talk about is why are we in a new round, or maybe a new spiral, or another level of spiral of violence in this conflict, and what can be done, as in what different actors, starting from international community to Azerbaijan, Armenia, and internationals and peacebuilding communities, so different actors in some form involved, what, in our view, could be done. What normatively, but also somewhat practically, considering kind of the real politics of the situation. Going to the content of what's happening, everybody, of course, knows already, but 2 days ago, Azerbaijan launched an attack on Nagorno-Karabakh and in what's remained of it, and I mean, two kind of very paradoxical things, right? In one case, in one sense, it was very predictable. Probably all of us were expecting this to happen. At the same time, I think it was entirely avoidable because there is nothing, in my view, that Azerbaijan going to achieve through this escalation, through this attack, that it could not have achieved through other means. Through diplomatic means and other means. It already achieved pretty crushing victory 3 years ago. So the question I have, at least for myself, is why is it that we are not able to come out of this spiral of violence? Why are we continually resorting to violence as seemingly the only way of addressing the problems and the conflict we have? There's nothing new about this, of course, for over 30 years of the conflict, or 26 years of negotiations that preceded the Second Karabakh War. Between the two wars, there was imitation of negotiations. None of the sides compromised. So all the peace process, very extensive peace process, with a very active involvement of international community. The Minsk group consisted of pretty much all the key global powers. So we cannot talk about absence of attention to this conflict, absence of effort to solve this conflict, yet none of that brought us any closer to solution. And the second war looked increasingly predictable and inevitable, and eventually we had it. So negotiations, peace process didn't lead us anywhere, neither then, not now. 3 years after the war, we are again not any closer to any solution. And okay, let's put this peace building and peace process, say, as a failure or ineffective mechanism An alternative potentially is what war and domination by one side. We had also two of these, right? So we had two wars with two pretty crushing victories. First for the Armenian side, now for Azerbaijan. And that didn't bring us any closer to the solution either. Armenian side initially wanting self-rule for Karabakh Armenians, achieved that, and yet went way further to control of multiple Azerbaijani territories that it didn't even claim, displaced times more people from these territories than the population of Karabakh for whom the self-rule was to be achieved, right? So essentially it went way further than reasonable in that absolutely did nothing for 26 years to compromise, essentially, preparing for the next war as opposed to trying to compromise. So that was Armenia's behavior after its victory. And now we are seeing the mirror image of Azerbaijan also achieving crushing victory this time in 2020, and again, not really willing to compromise or make any moves towards peace. There has been nothing done really to prepare the populations for coexistence. It has been only ongoing escalation throughout the last 3 years. The negotiations have been very ineffective. And again, we cannot talk about lack of attention. This is one of the conflicts that has maybe excess attention of international community, of different actors, 3 different platforms of negotiation, right? So everything you can imagine could be done in a way is being done, and yet the violence seems to be the only way forward. So I think the question, Lala, if I can turn to you, how would you explain? So why are we stuck in this cycle, not even cycle, spiral?
Yeah, thank you for a comprehensive explanation and introductory words. I pretty much agree with all of them. And my personal explanation to what you have already said would be just to add 2 things. First is about the improper process of peace, let's say. I cannot even call whatever we had prior this process, prior this 2020 and during all these years, all these decades, a peace process. I don't consider it a peace process, which was a closed doors, which were very elitist, and populations were almost not involved, and the very small group of peace builders from both sides were trying to do something, but of course, vis-a-vis the propaganda machine and the forces and the power of the government, whatever we could do was already limited. So we never had even, I would say, a chance properly to build a peace along these decades. And this Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict is one of these rare modern conflicts that actually populations don't even have a context with each other. And the generations are just raised in hatred and complete limbo, and not understanding that the humans living on the other side is actually also human beings. And there's no need to hate them or be afraid of them. So without this proper process, whatever been negotiated for all these years, it couldn't give any results. And expecting peace, expecting that we would reach a point where the 2 nations will live in peaceful coexistence, I think was naive from our side. Because we never had the control to check what's going on, and none of our governments were accountable to us, to people, let's say. And second, I think, is the dominating idea of nationalism, which is still one of the hegemonic ideas in the not only Armenia, Azerbaijan, but probably the post-Soviet realm. But this is the idea that actually traps us in very rigid formats of political communities, in a very rigid formats of how we can coexist with each other. And in case of Armenia and Azerbaijan, the nations are basically constructed on antagonism of each other. So being Azerbaijani means hating Armenians. And with this type of national construction, imagining a peaceful coexistence, for me, to be honest, is almost impossible. It would mean a total transformation of Azerbaijani national identity in order to peacefully coexist. And of course, investment in this type of nationalistic rhetoric and not committing to peace and not preparing again its own population for coexistence with the enemy image that was constructed, it would never lead to peaceful coexistence. So just to be brief, why we are here, in my view, in all additions to what you said, it's also a huge commitment to nationalism and very few efforts to actually build a sustainable peace. Yeah. But then, Phil, just maybe stir this conversation and move forward from all this introductory thoughts and why we are stuck here. Maybe we can discuss what can be done actually after this. Okay, we reached this point when we had 2 wars, endless cycles of violence, not a single ability to negotiate and listen to each other and emphasize empathy, having empathy to each other. So what do you think can be realistically done? Realistically, and of course in the short term and maybe in the long term.
Thanks. I think on this one we probably agree to disagree, but I think the peace process, I do consider the peace process existed in a sense as good as it could have been, in a sense that practically every mechanism known was there to provide opportunity for the sides to come together. And until 2020 war, the 2 sides also had agency. I think it was a rare conflict, different from, let's say, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, in the neighborhood where Armenian Azerbaijani governments and Karabakh government authorities also essentially could have, between themselves, reached a compromise solution, right? So I think that's somewhat of a rare gift almost we had for a number of years, which we wasted. At this point, it's already much more of a proxy conflict with involvement of many great powers. So I believe there was a chance for peace. There was a lot of effort put towards official negotiations. Now, whether or not these formats are functional or not, a bit of a theoretical discussion maybe, but in my view, a lot has been done. Possibility was there for a solution. Yeah, what now? We are where we are. So in my view, the absolute priority is to provide opportunity, routes, safe passage for full evacuation of the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh at this stage. I think it's absolute priority, at least to those who want to leave, which I would presume to be the big majority. The population has been in blockade and essentially starved for 9 months. There has been nothing done for 3 years, especially in the last 9 months, to, in some form, prepare them for integration or coexistence. So at this point, believe that they could live safely and with some rights. It's very hard to imagine, and let them maybe proved wrong, right? So that the passage, I think, is absolute priority. People need to be able to evacuate, take a breath, to get food, and then yes, let's organize all the conditions for safe living in Karabakh, and let whoever is returning to return, right? So essentially, nothing evacuating populations today precludes returning in a week or in a month and continuing to live, right? So essentially, there's no, it's like Armenia is just a couple of hours drive away from where the population is now located, primarily all in Stepanakert at this point. So in my view, that's absolute priority for the Armenian government. I don't see them having done anything. Pashinyan has practically washed his hands off. And I can understand his predicament, as in, yes, military intervention in the last 2 days would have been suicidal for the Armenian state, and that was probably not an option. But he also draws some red lines when needed. For example, on Zangezur corridor, I haven't seen him put any red line on the lives of the Armenians of Karabakh, or preparing the evacuation either in the last 3 years or currently, and putting that as a major, simply the humanitarian condition. If anything, today's speech showed that it doesn't take any responsibility for the lives of these people. So the Armenian side needs to be fully prepared. I assume on technical level they are prepared, but it needs to be also political. Again, yes, not intervening militarily, I understand, but talking very specifically about evacuation and lives of people and providing everything they can on the border and otherwise is not there yet. Same applies to international community and to Azerbaijan, in my view, and obviously to Russian peacekeepers who completely abducted their responsibilities by now. So if anything to be done, yes, they were being called to Azerbaijan to de-escalate, great. I haven't seen calls to evacuate. I haven't seen any kind of serious push to evacuate. We are talking about 100,000 people. So I think that's absolutely first priority. And that does not mean they have to permanently remain in Armenia. By all means, step two, create conditions for return. So that, in my view, again, the big priority, absolutely, at least the right should be there, and that should be the big push from everybody, from my position. That immediately. In a bigger picture, I think the Armenian side, essentially, what's the de facto already happened. Azerbaijan has taken full control of what has been long acknowledged this territory, essentially the full Karabakh as well. Time to accept de jure. From Armenian side, there have been some innuendos from Pashinyan, probably needs to be done more formally and by everybody, along with, and this is like an important kind of point too, of accepting Azerbaijan jurisdiction over Karabakh formally already, is that should come with full amnesty for all the ex-combatants, right? Full provisions, clear provisions for the rights of the Armenian population, the safety mechanisms, and so on and so forth. So that's not in place. So talking about integration, talking about not allowing this population to live without that, it's a major problem, which should be already. And it's also a recipe for continuation of the conflict. That means Russian peacekeepers who prove to be not peacekeepers, but I don't even want to discuss what. It creates a ground for continuous conflict. And so on. So again, acceptance, yes, of Azerbaijan's sovereignty, along with simultaneously provisions for amnesty and for rights. Of what that's on Karabakh. What should happen on Armenia-Azerbaijan relations and international community? Sorry, actually, let me return to Karabakh one more time. Before that, is that we talk about integration, right? So that's Azerbaijan has taken control. For 3 years, nothing has been done at all, again, to prepare the populations for coexistence, nothing. So another very important and almost necessary, if this is to go anywhere but further violence, step is to actually allow civil societies to come in and engage in confidence building, trust building measures. There has been insane amount of violence for 30 years, multiple massacres, ongoing violence now. So that's decades of actually confidence building, at least years, to put people in a position when they can peacefully coexist without escalating into a new cycle of violence. That's not simply a normative point, it's a very practical one. Finally, what comes to international community, and by international community, using as a shorthand for the West, I guess, collective West, it has been a on and off very problematic actor, right? So Azin has been, yes, great. It's been supporting some peace building measures. Yes, it's been running some negotiations, but it's been also very opportunistic and unpredictable and kind of coming in and out a bit too quickly, out being a key word here. And that did factor into calculations of pretty much all the states, the South Caucasus states, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, in moving overall further away from the West and towards Russia. I specifically remember this conversation once I had in, I think, 2008 or 9 with an Azerbaijani diplomat when these contacts were still possible, who was a liberal Democrat in his ideology, but the point he made was, yes, I was pushing for democratization in Azerbaijan and moving to kind of more integration with the European Union. But after 2008 war, when in Georgia and Ossetia, where Georgia basically fully moved west, and once it faced existential threat, essentially it was left alone. So it's just simply shown that we have no path towards democratization. The only kind of path we have that can guarantee survival of Azerbaijan is closer ties with Russia, essentially autocratization in the model of Russia. All right, so that's Azerbaijan. Georgia, we see making the same move in the last 2 years, right? So, and Armenia overall has been for years going in that direction. And now you see quite an opportunistic move from the United States to pull Armenia towards the West. Armenia seemed to be very kind of jumping on the opportunity, and a very strong chance of that being again left alone to face the consequences, potentially existential, very soon. So I think West has to be much more clear and systematic and long-term about its intentions, and to be very clear with these governments about its limitations. So I'll stop there and see what you have to offer.
Well, thank you, Phil. I think I mostly agree. I have very slight disagreements on the evacuation part. Actually, not a disagreement, just a broader thinking or thinking out loud. What would actually, whether it's a smart move or call for pressure point as a pressure point to evacuate the people, or actually to ask for guarantees and start the negotiations with Azerbaijani government for getting some guarantees and basically stopping the escalation and the war, the clashes that's going on there. Because evacuation, if Armenian population is evacuated, I highly doubt that there could be a mechanism to come back, and how long there will be a negotiation for coming back, and how in the long term it will actually will look like, whether it will be the population and how the things happen in Anatolia, which is left completely without Armenians, and all the heritage is disappeared. So I know I will be very much criticized for these views, but as much as I don't want to see the Karabakh without Azerbaijanis, as much as I don't want to see the Karabakh without Armenians. So evacuation and leaving the population in the very long term is a very, very big question for me, whether the people would be able to come back actually. But also it's a very difficult situation, because in the short term, what is the alternative for these people and how they can live, and whether actually pushing for guarantees, for security guarantees, will give any kind of results. This is, I think, the question, and I'm not really settled on, and will slightly disagree with you here. And about the peace building part, I think we're completely in a new reality. If some kind of deal will be reached between Nagorno-Karabakh authorities and Azerbaijani government, then we will be in a very new reality of integration of Armenian population into Azerbaijani society, and how imagining the coexistence of Armenians and Azerbaijanis together in Karabakh. I think as peace building community, we were always on some completely different level of operation. It was always building peace between, yes, generally Armenians and Azerbaijanis, as a general community, societies, and we had a very little focus, I would say, on Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians because of well-known reasons. But now, yeah, I think we don't have concrete answers how this process will look like. I have a lot of questions actually, which I don't have answers to. For example, how this integration process will look like, what kind of rights they will have, how we will live together, I mean, how Azerbaijanis will be returning back, and how everything will look like. And the Azerbaijani government does not provide any answers to this question so far. And even if they have any plan, it's clearly kept very well in secret and not publicly available for discussions. So yes, in this new reality, how the peace building community will react, it's not clear, and I think that we don't even have a discussions going on within the civil societies, let's say. Because I think we never even imagined that this can happen, that we will reach anytime the point when Karabakh and Armenians of Karabakh will be under authorities of Azerbaijan's government. So yeah, how to go on from this? I think this is the question that we as civil society should now discuss and brainstorm, and maybe come up together and think of some kind of roadmap, and what can happen, what can we offer. But yeah, this is what I think. If you have anything to add here.
I mean, I guess apart from the main question we're discussing now, being evacuation or non-evacuation, I frankly think it's not in my view, is not up to us, yeah. So as in not anybody who is not in there, not in that position. So I'm not talking about forced evacuation. I'm talking about every mechanism of, as in open road, infrastructure for accepting anybody who moves, which again I would assume it's a majority at this stage. Now again, nothing has been done so far to prove to this population that they can safely leave under Azerbaijani control. So once that is in some form established, there some population probably will stay behind, right? So those once the mechanism is there, then or the security guarantees are in place, living conditions are in place. By all means, let it be like 2-year rehabilitation in Armenia before they return, right? So, but if they will not, then that probably means the living conditions and security were never provided. Actually, I would assume similarly that following the Second Karabakh War, Armenians will not return because the majority actually left during the war, and the passage was, of course, there. And yet, right, as Russian peacekeepers came in, the assumption of security guarantees was in place, which proved clearly false. But then, as the assumption was in place, practically everybody, the very big majority actually returned, right? Very few stayed out. So in a sense, the interest to continue living in Karabakh from the Armenians is there. The conditions, the security is not there. So I think it's very obvious in my view that it should be provided the chance to leave. This is also, again, going back to peace building community and international community and Armenian government. For me, these are absolute immediate priorities that I don't see being taken enough or being spoken about enough. Yes, violence was stopped immediately with very big number of casualties for 1 day of fighting. But right, what about the life of people who for 9 months have been in a blockade? So that's on that. And questions, I think a couple of questions are being raised exactly on these points, as in there are like some political inconveniences for Azerbaijan. If this happens, they will be accused of ethnic cleansing. I can say the mirror that Armenian government also seem to be worried about facilitating essentially in some form ethnic cleansing of Karabakh. So both governments seem to be reluctant to move in that direction. But then they should have in some form worked for the last 2 years to provide opportunities for integration and coexistence. That has not been done. So considering that, it becomes a moral obligation, but it also the pressure on Azerbaijani government, I think, should be mounted of providing a chance for anybody who wants to leave as absolute priority. So that also applies to the second. There is another question again, yeah. So of currently, effectively, the civilian passage, although A, doesn't exist. 2, even if it exists, there is a question of what civilian. Right now, what de facto you can see what's happening is the civilians are essentially limited to only a minority of women and children. So anybody who bore arm, which is probably the majority of the male population, the de facto authorities, which again includes it in one time or another, a pretty big part of the population, and their families are excluded, so essentially from the civilian list. So there is a very good chance of repressions now of a majority of our Armenian population, which brings me back to the point of safe living is far from being guaranteed. But also, again, necessitates, if Azerbaijan's right over this territory is validated and put on paper, it needs to come simultaneously or almost as a second step to the full amnesty for the wars. Otherwise, it essentially becomes as a recipe for repression in a both short and a long term. So without that, essentially accepting Azerbaijan's de facto already control the jure means leaving this population to a very violent fate. So to your point of the vision for the civil society or overall peace building, either international or local, I think we for first 30 years we worked in a, not first 30 years maybe too much, but in 90s and 2000s at least, the peace was to be done through democratization. And I know I've been talking about this, but I'll keep repeating, is that our all civil society, all the Western international community is used to thinking of peace building in a very liberal democratic terms. It's some form of rights, as Armenians stay and they have full rights as citizens. We are not, Azerbaijan is not a democracy, talking about rights of Azerbaijani population of any background, particularly those who've been labeled for 30 years and right now as internal enemy, essentially, right? Their rights within authoritarian system is practically impossible to guarantee. So looking at peace building through democratization, great, as in maybe 50 years down the road, that kind of long-term plan can continue. But in the most immediate future, I think that peace building and democracy building should be absolutely decoupled from each other. There will not be democracy in the foreseeable future, so that is not a mechanism through which we can achieve any coexistence. So we need to start looking far more into authoritarian spaces and activism, peace activism and other types of activism in authoritarian spaces, which is qualitatively very different from peace building in democratic space. We are using very misplaced mechanisms, essentially, of trying to build peace in this case. So in some form of stronger protections by external actors, segregation, essentially, of the populations, again, right for passage, mechanisms for physical survival, and some degree of self-rule, right? So a lot of other mechanisms should be put in place, both between the two sides, before the population of Karabakh, but also between Armenia and Azerbaijan before it's possible to get to some kind of democracy building dream in the future. And maybe one more comment about why some can see Armenians still not sign, Armenian government in this case, not signing a peace deal. The way we are approaching this conflict, Armenians did the same thing for the previous 30 years, yes, as I mentioned a few times. They were putting forward absolutely unrealistic, absolutely unacceptable conditions. So as in we took over Azerbaijani territory, you just accept and move on. Of course, it was not going to happen. Not only Azerbaijan, nobody in the international community was going to accept that military victory in '94 absolutely did not give any, neither possibility nor right to build the future on the de facto taking control and displacement of hundreds of thousands of people. Now Azerbaijan, again, is trying to pull something similar, as in, yes, they want a decisive victory, and what they are demanding from the Armenian government, its demands are kind of growing day by day. So every time you come to negotiating table, the demands going steps further, from enclaves to Zangezur corridor to what else, which makes Armenia simply a non-viable state. So there is no point in, as much as non-signing a peace deal is dangerous and potentially questions Armenian statehood, just as much is the peace deal that's on the table. So actually demanding or asking for a peace deal that essentially destroys the Armenian statehood is not a peace deal that any Armenian government in its right mind should sign. And destroying a state in the South Caucasus is also dangerous for all the other actors as well. Having a failed state, collapsing state in the middle of South Caucasus, it's a recipe for escalating this into the second front of Russia-NATO war. So it should be, Azerbaijan has taken all probably could have dreamt of 3 years ago, probably time to draw a line somewhere and accept types of a peace deal or a capitulation of Armenia that leaves Armenia as a viable state. I don't see that yet being on the table.
Yes, okay, I totally agree with you, but let me again maybe slightly express a different opinion about the democratization and decoupling, democratization and peace building, and then we can go to the audience with the questions. So if anyone has questions, please already post. Yes, I see why you're saying it from Armenian perspective, but from an Azerbaijani perspective, decoupling peace activism from democratization doesn't make any sense to me. And especially if we are talking about integration of Armenians, then and peace building in this new reality, then still building democracy and resisting authoritarianism should be a priority. Still, it should continue. And it's impossible for me to decouple that because we have seen how authoritarian regimes end and how it leads to wars and what kind of disasters it brings, not only to the neighboring countries, but also to their own population. So from my position, I don't think it's possible to decouple peace building, peace activism, let's say, and building democracy, or not necessarily in a liberal understanding of democracy, but basically resisting authoritarian regime. And I think we have already, if you don't have anything to add for the last point.
No, I can appreciate that, and I do see the difference. So, yeah, in sense, as an Armenian, internally, those in Armenia do live in relative democracy. So in that sense, that's probably less of a priority than for Azerbaijani citizens themselves. So I see the need there and the connection between the two. I think I was talking more about the very immediate fate of 100,000 people essentially stranded in that territory, and in that sense, trying to ensure their rights through some democratic process doesn't seem to be a realistic approach. So I think that was the reference. In a big picture, I fully agree that peace cannot come without overall broader Azerbaijani population being able to live in democratizing space. There are some questions you already answered. I mentioned there are two others that connect specifically on the question of peace building and confidence building. So one question, so let me read both and then see which one you want to pick up, or maybe both. So one question is that it's in where who should peace builders focus on? Yeah, which populations or which type of actors in the two societies? So who should peace builders focus their energies on to engage? Is the question? Is it governments? Is it societies? Yeah, what's realistic? That's one question. And I think the question in this case is about foreign international peace builders, as in how they can come in and be useful. That's the way I understand the question. The second question is more for, it's about, in the current situation, how do you see peace building, as in how do you see the role of Armenian peace builders specifically? Okay, yes, there are Azerbaijani peace builders, and the state will probably authorize some Gongos, yeah, some government-affiliated NGOs to do some work. Is there a space, or what's the role of Armenians essentially in being able to facilitate the coexistence process? So so either internationals or Armenians, how do you see that?
Yeah, it's a difficult question because, again, for all this time, for all these 30 years, we never actually engaged with the population and actors. We engaged on a very limited level, yeah? So if we're talking about the groups, the people who from NK itself are able to participate actually in peace building process, it's a question, right? Because we're always working with Armenian counterparts, and we reach now a point when actual Armenian counterparts will not be allowed, for example, participate in this process, and probably civil society from Nagorno-Karabakh is a very small and very weak, or we don't have any ties, because during these years they were not involved in this broader, they were very limitedly involved in this peace building process. So my point would be that I cannot even imagine when we can start this, whether the population from Nagorno-Karabakh population are ready to start the peace building process with Azerbaijani counterparts, and how Azerbaijani government will allow the Armenian actors and peace builders to come and participate. For me, this will go through the main demand, or main, let's say, discussion point that we should raise from now on, is the open the communications, basically, or at least let the peace builders or the the part of population which is not alienated from each other, which had ties for this period, for this long period, and already participated in peace building, come and travel to both countries and start from grassroots working somehow. And second point would be hugely invest in civil society in Nagorno-Karabakh, so that they are themselves are part of the process and counterparts, not through, they have their own agency, not through Armenians from Armenia, but now they became a different actor actually, which unfortunately we were neglecting so far. So this would be my understanding of situation.
And to internationals, anything? International civil society, as I understand in this case.
Well, I think international civil society would be actually the actors and the supporters who can stir somehow, who have the resources actually. It's another question and another problem that most of the resources coming from international actors to the NGOs and peace building in the Caucasus. So of course, their support and the mechanisms and under their umbrella, the peace builders from Armenia probably can come to Azerbaijan, or through this type of mechanisms we can establish the ties. So I still think there is a lot of role in international peace building community, because they are still one of the major actors and the major resource holders in peace building arena.
Well, let me try to roll through the questions. Another one is about transitional justice, and again, in some form things are being turned. That's probably the again, separating people into civilians and non-civilians, and effectively arresting what we've seen already moves in the direction of former combatants could be turned in Azerbaijan in some form as transitional justice. The question was, that's probably what we will see. And is there what could be done essentially to have a more of a fair two-sided transitional justice process? I think an important question. We've been talking about transitional justice for years now without seeing any provisions being put in place. I think that's similar to overall peace building, right? So an overall preparation for coexistence has been absolutely neglected. Again, throughout the whole 30 years, but both sides, in this case now, the pressure more is, I would say, on Azerbaijan. But in principle, there has been multiple war crimes throughout the two wars and outside of them. If we are talking about coexistence, if we are talking about moving forward, yeah, that kind of a fully victor's justice, essentially punishing, will probably satisfy some political goals of the particular Azerbaijani government, essentially, but it will not hardly will bring us any closer to peace. The level of violence we had, the continuity of it, right? So the level of humiliation we had initially by the Azerbaijanis, now by Armenians, over these 30 years is I mean, if you compare that to other conflicts, it's pretty deep. It will probably take decades to come out of this, even if we were to put serious transitional justice mechanisms and confidence building mechanisms in place. So I think that is a perspective I'd see missing. And yes, right now Azerbaijan is dominant vis-a-vis Armenia. Again, how long, right? So like if you're talking about 30, 50 years sprint here, probably 100 years, which the wounds of this war, these two wars and what followed will be there, right? So tables turn over and over and over. So let's keep that perspective in mind, right? So this is what I'm trying to communicate. I was telling to Armenians now, to Azerbaijan is like, think a bit long term, like at some point tables will turn, and not a threat. It's just like you don't put more just transitional justice mechanisms in place or confidence building, sooner or later you're gonna have cycles of revenge continue. So I agree with the question. I think it cannot be only Azerbaijan-led transitional justice mechanism that will be seen as legitimate. If anything, it will be seen as further persecution of Armenians. So it's necessary to be at this point international, since the trust between the two is absolutely non-existent.
Yes, and this transitional justice is not only about the courts and the justice system, but it's also about the peace-building process. And it's necessary. It's establishing the truth commissions. It's it's demystifying all the myths that we have against each other. It's apologies. It's more complex than just a persecution of the former criminals. And I think this is where also the role of international community can help. There is a lot of lessons in the world and practices where we can learn how to establish this joint transitional commissions, and took the process from there. So yeah, transitional justice can be and should be, I think, in the discourse somewhere among the peacebuilding community.
There is a question, yeah, I fully agree that transitional justice is absolutely not only about tribunals and essentially criminal justice end of it, but it's also about memory politics and essentially amnesties and reconciliation, I guess, is the word. And another question is probably more to you than me, is what's the reaction of the broader population in Azerbaijan to what's happening?
Well, I think it's still very much supportive, but I also see some kind of tiredness, very silent tiredness. But it's very silent and very implicit. But overall, the reaction was very supportive. Of course, it was very supportive. Yes.
Further questions? Assuming Azerbaijan takes full control over Karabakh, and we discussed already the difficulty of Armenian civil society or actors being involved in any form of confidence building. Perhaps local Armenians will be better positioned in this case than Armenians from Armenia, as you mentioned. The question is, what about, again, somewhat internationals, as in about how they can facilitate, assuming there will be abolition essentially of de facto now already of Karabakh as a unit, autonomous unit or something, right? So there is, then you're not dealing anymore with Karabakh authorities, you're dealing essentially with Azerbaijan in central power. So, and presumably with a military presence of Azerbaijan on the ground in the long term, essentially. So how can internationals engage? Also, with the question is, they will have to work with potentially military authorities and central authorities. How can they do this without legitimizing, which potentially can be a pretty coercive approach?
Yeah, the problem is that it's hard to respond to this question because we don't know how the situation will look like. We don't know what is on the field, like on the ground, and how the reality will change tomorrow or changing right now while we are talking here. So how the situation, the political situation will be formed in Nagorno-Karabakh is a big question. And without knowing that answer to that question, whether there will be any authorities or not, or whether the population will actually be there or not, it's hard to respond how internationals can engage. And let's put aside internationals, how ourselves, the locals, will engage with this. We don't know, because it's, for me, for example, it's a question how the situation will evolve. That's why it's hard for me to respond to this question. I don't know what you think about it.
Oh, I think, I mean, I can probably connect this with another question that came up, which is, well, two other questions, actually. One is that we mentioned that we don't think the peace process, you specifically, that the peace process was proper. So what is the proper peace process? And then the second question is about I'm sorry, I lost the question, sorry.
It's
about internationals again, and how,
yes.
yeah. And how can they interact, or should they work to Baku and Yerevan,
yes.
or what else? Again, I haven't seen I think in my view, at least, the international, specifically West in this case, has been very active. Again, I don't see it's not one of the conflicts that is neglected. Well, 30 minutes after escalation, you had Blinken pretty much as given relative passivity of Biden as a person. It gets as high as it gets, right? So Antony Blinken, Secretary of State of the U.S., immediately jumped into the conversation, called Pashinyan and Aliyev, issued a pretty strong statement, right? So we've seen Sullivan, National Security Advisor to the President, and Blinken hold 4-day negotiations in Washington. And so it's a very high level in the European, and you see personal engagement of Macron, of Charles Michel, and so on and so forth. So it's a very, very high level of almost constant engagement. So in that sense, you do have as many mechanisms as possible in place in a pretty high political level. I think what we haven't seen so far necessarily, in my view at least, again, first is a chance for Armenians to leave. I don't think that everybody found it politically inconvenient. It has been discussed behind closed doors, but again, in my view, that if I'm going to keep restating, the chance, the right should be there. But also on this one, so engaging civil society, yes, through coordination maybe with governments. There is also security questions involved, but there are things that governments simply are not able to do, right? So military, as in solving everything through police and military, can go so far, right? It also tends to escalate violence. So I think more explicit push for maybe also international civil society at this point also to come in, and both as safeguards and providers of humanitarian aid, which is absolutely necessary, but also to PTSD and other forms of psychological support people need, but also ensuring a very basic safety and coexistence. There hasn't been enough of this done, and certainly has not been enough or at all any focus on issues of transitional justice and reconciliation. Again, the political end of the conflict is effectively over. Essentially, that you cannot in any kind of foreseeable future imagine Armenians putting any political claims on Karabakh. So that's done. So what to do, with how to make this livable for Azerbaijanis who are going to return to coexist. So it's not only demining. Yes, demining is extremely important. Absolutely has to be done. It's that's should not have happened in the first place, of course. Absolutely important. But right, so what next? Okay, Azerbaijanis return. How are they going to coexist? Right. So so that I don't see that. I don't see enough attention to this coming from internationals, and I think how much effort they put into it. On a very high political level, I think they should be advanced much further. The role of Turkey.
You want to go?
Yeah. Again, it's changing. I think saying it as yes, of course, by big picture level, it's a pretty stable ally of Azerbaijan. We've seen, of course, Turkey's involvement in the Second Karabakh War and pretty consistently supporting anything. And yet, it's probably grayer, as in less an actor than we probably tend to imagine. Unfortunately, the normalization with Armenia didn't proceed, so that should have been clearly an important step following the Second Karabakh War, and that is something I think, given the new, in a way, government Turkey has very deprioritized improvement of relations with the normalization with Armenia, and yet didn't necessarily turn away from it. That's another direction where I think US and probably US more than European potentially pressure and putting, if there is an interest to reduce the destructive, at this point, very presence of Russia in the region is a priority, which seems to be a priority. I do believe that the road lies through Turkey. Yeah, US has very limited presence in the region. Its policies might change if there is a change of government next year. So there is essentially the road to some form of opening of Caucasus away from Russian influence, which might re-engage pretty strongly once the situation in Ukraine settles somewhat. And I do believe it will continue being destructive. So considering that, if there is an interest to increase Western influence, NATO influence in the Caucasus, it does lie through Turkey, and that does lie through Turkey's normalization with Armenia, which again has been processing very slowly and has been absolutely prioritized. That's on Turkey. There are more questions I didn't have a chance to read. I don't know if you had, Lala.
Yeah, I think this question is probably for you. In case there are larger numbers of Armenians from NK evacuated to Armenia and they decide to stay there for now, what are the things they will need in the short and midterm?
Yeah, no, very good question. Again, my hope and assumption, maybe a bit of information also, is that there has been some behind-the-scene preparations taking place. I think this was unfortunately very predictable. development. So in a sense, Armenia, I think, is a bit better position to accept a large number than we think it is. My criticism was less on its technical preparedness and much more on politically not speaking up, in favor of this. I understand the political damage that could bring to Pashinyan, but I think this is such a big red line that it should have been raised. So I think Armenia is not as bad positioned as we think it is. Absolutely need, given the international attention we have right now, to make this a big priority so it's actually livable conditions. And yes, I understand that and compensations and so on and so forth, because people have been for 9 months essentially deprived of anything. Probably any saving or anything they had is gone by now, given the prices for food in Karabakh for the last 9 months and what else. So there should, and so that's one, I think, a serious investment into these people, along with, of course, preparing for the rise to return, along with a very major psychological support. I think we shouldn't be underestimating the damage that has been done through the Second Karabakh War, but also the last 9 months. That has been incredible. Really, and especially last 3 days, third or fourth round of essentially displacement of pretty sizable part of the Karabakh population. So once in 2020, before that, and then now, right now, we know thousands of people have been displaced already from parts of Karabakh into Stepanakert. So I think the pretty serious social support, but also very serious focus on rights. There is also a question of, for example, people without Armenian passports. So there is an assumption of all Karabakh Armenians have Armenian passports. I don't believe that is the case, right? So they are essentially stateless. There are a lot of these level questions, which again, I think Armenia has a pretty good actually migration service. So it's one of the parts of the government that functions well. I think it's very well, relatively well equipped to potentially handle this, but it will need a lot of support.
Yes, and I think we have 3 minutes left and the last 2 questions. And one question is, since the funding for civil society is shifting from peace building to disaster resilience, how do you think is the likelihood of peace builders being left without proper funding, and how actually to realign this funding and shrinking space and function effectively? I think this is something that we discussed actually yesterday about the funding. So you want to start me, or you want to go first?
You go.
Okay, so my personal opinion is that we are really, as a Caucasus, not just Armenia, Azerbaijan, are dependent on very few international actors that are in our region. And yes, if they realign their priorities and change the priorities or somehow disappear from the scene, we will be very seriously paralyzed. And I think one of the ways out of this as a community who is dedicated to peace building is to think of the diversifying of funds and basically building a pool of funds that are not dependent on 1, 2, 3, or let's say 5 big actors, but so that if that one of them or 2 of them are pulling off from the scene, there will be 10, for example, different actors or funders that are still committed to peace building. So diversifying is, I think, something that we need urgently to think about, in my view. I don't know, Phil, what you think here. You are muted. Can you please unmute?
Yeah, no, I fully agree. That has been monopolization of funding stream essentially coming through the European Union, which the amounts went up considerably compared to, say, 10, 15 years ago. But essentially it became from multiple donors, one donor, and it's structurally, so I'm not against that. There was no ill intention from European Union in doing it. If anything, it was supporting. But de facto, it led to essentially the smaller funders leaving the region because they saw it as the field as financially saturated, and essentially we are too dependent on one donor. So if it's there's a decrease of funding, right, or any kind of a diversion of attention, essentially there is no infrastructure for continued peace building. So I do fully agree that diversification of funding sources is absolutely necessary for sustainability, because this conflict is, hopefully the violence will go away, but even if it goes away tomorrow, dealing with the repercussions of violence, it's a work for many years, if not decades, very unfortunately. There was to wrap up, as we promised, there was a question actually from Lara, was that about not the mood in the society, but about the elites and peace builders. In my view, from what I'm seeing, if you allow me, is that there is more. So it's not similar to prior to 2020, where you had very few Azerbaijani peace builders. There are many, many more, including from Gongos, government-connected civil society, who in principle are speaking up, and either openly or not, in favor of, already kind of scaling back the oppressive measures and engaging constructively. So I think the field is there, that almost the soft demands, small, not in capacity is there as well. At least my view, my take is that I've seen much more, and I think it is possible if there is an opening on the high level.
Yeah, what's interesting, before this escalation, the last one, there were a lot of actually Gongos who started to speak about peace very strangely, which was perceived very strange. But this is something, I think the question is whether they can actually influence the Azerbaijani government, but this is something coming from Azerbaijani government. So I don't think there are, I'm pretty sure, individuals who can actually, and who are advising probably the government, or talking to them, or reaching out and delivering the, let's say, the more, not pressure mechanisms, but delivering the right messages, let's say, like of how to coexist, or how to move from this situation in a better way for both sides, in a more compromising side. But these are very, I think, few individuals, and this type of actions are, I think, very private and closed or not public. Whatever is publicly done, it's either Gongos, which the messages are coming from the government. I don't see them anyhow influencing the government. But whoever is clearly speaking and having the anti-war position, I don't think government will talk or listen to them, or get any kind of advice from these people.
Thank you. I mean, just to honor again our promise to finish early, like a couple of maybe concluding thoughts. Of course, not hopeful. There was, I assume there was no assumption that we can put something positive here. But if I mean, my point, at least big one, was that evacuation, at least possibility of moving to Armenia safely, is an absolute immediate necessity, along with a peace agreement that provides for a viable Armenian state, having roads and territories safeguarded and so on. But then what we agreed on was, I think, the necessity for investment into confidence building measures, people to people, which might sound trivial, but has not been being done, and more involvement with Armenians of Karabakh. And I mean, if my final point will, we need to learn to solve problems without violence. It's just, again, and a lot of the things that has been now de facto taking place could have been done in a much more effective way without violence, and yet this is the only mechanism we seem to fall back on continually. So that somehow needs to be stopped. So with that, I'll save the next webinar. We don't know the date yet, but we are trying to do more on geopolitics, essentially Russia, Azerbaijan, Armenia triangle, and discuss that and bring more realist thinkers into the mix. So that's, again, we don't have the names confirmed, so that I cannot unfortunately tell the dates, but we are trying to organize it relatively quickly, probably next week if possible. So we are in a conversation with a couple of analysts. So once we have it, please be on the lookout. We will try to announce a bit sooner than we did this time. So thank you once again for joining us very last minute.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Phil.